dynamics. Now, different types of modulation. What are different types of modulations? As we have two types of waves, analog wave and digital wave. When we have a modulation that is of analog wave, we call it as a analog modulation. And if we have a modulation that is due to the digital wave, we call it as a digital modulation. At the analog wave असेल, तर there are again in analog wave we have a continuous wave, or you can have a pulses of the wave. When we have a continuous wave, and if the only amplitude is changed, that is amplitude of the carrier is changed, that is called as a amplitude modulation. And if you have a analog wave and frequency and phase changes, when frequency and phase changes, there occurs a change in the angle, that is called as an angle modulation. So analog modulation, again 3 types, depending whether you have a continuous wave or analog wave. First thing is that amplitude modulation, depending on the variation in the amplitude of the carrier signal, angle modulation due to the change in the angle of the carrier signal, and pulse analog modulation due to the pulses in the continuous wave of a carrier signal. Now, angle modulation is again bifurcated into 2 categories: frequency modulation and phase modulation. If the frequency of a carrier is varied according to the amplitude of the information signal, then we call it as a frequency modulation. And if the phase of the carrier is varied according to the amplitude of the information signal, then it is called as a phase modulation. We are discussing later on in detail. At pulse analog मध्ये already we have discussed. जर amplitude pulse बदलत असेल, it is called as a pulse amplitude modulation. If the frequency of the pulse is width of the pulse is changing, pulse width modulation. If the position of a pulse is changing, it is called as a pulse position modulation. So, analog modulation can be categorized into 3 parts: amplitude modulation, angle modulation, pulse analog modulation. Again, angle modulation can be categorized into frequency modulation and phase modulation. A pulse analog modulation can be categorized as pulse amplitude modulation and pulse width modulation and pulse position modulation. So if you suppose wave is a digital in nature, it is in the form of binary 1 and zeros. At that point, you have digital modulation. You have pulse code modulation technique. The pulses are coded, pulse code modulation. And then you have a delta modulation. We are going to discuss it one by one in the next slide. Now, you should keep in mind, modulation is the process in which the information signal is superimposed on some other high frequency carrier signal so that it can be propagated for low or longer distances. Now, for this propagation, the carrier wave can be either analog or it can be a digital wave. When we have an analog wave, we have 3 types: amplitude modulation, angle modulation, then we have pulse analog modulation. When we have a digital wave, we have a pulse code modulation and delta modulation. Again, the amplitude modulation is the process in which the amplitude of the carrier signal is varied according to the amplitude of information signal. Whereas the frequency modulation, that is a part of the angle modulation, we have change in the frequency of a carrier signal according to the amplitude of the information signal. That is called as a frequency modulation. Then we have a phase modulation. There is a change in the phase of the carrier signal according to the amplitude of the information signal. That is called as a phase modulation. Now the pulse analog modulation can be divided depending whether there is a change in the amplitude, pulse amplitude modulation, change in width, pulse width modulation, change in position, pulse position modulation. We'll take one example of amplitude modulation for today and then we'll stop. Now, what is amplitude modulation? We have a separate unit on amplitude modulation, very important part. All the radios, all India radios were AM waves. They worked on the AM. जुने जे रेडिओ होते ते. आता आपण FM म्हणतो. FM रेडिओ म्हणतो. आकाशवाणीचं उस्मानाबाद केंद्र, FM रेडिओ. आकाशवाणीचं पुणे केंद्र, AM रेडिओ. Amplitude modulation. Amplitude modulation is the process in which the amplitude of the carrier signal is varied according to the amplitude of the information signal by keeping frequency and phase constant. Simple. बघा लक्षात येते. Very simple. If the amplitude of the carrier signal is varied according to the amplitude of the information signal by keeping frequency and phase constant. That is called as a amplitude modulation. Very simple. If the amplitude of the carrier signal is varied according to the amplitude of the information signal by keeping its frequency and phase constant, is called as the amplitude modulation process. मग आता इथं काय झालं, एक इन्फॉर्मेशन सिग्नल आला, एक कॅरियर सिग्नल आला, and then we have a modulated signal. आता बघा, this is my information signal, this is my message. मी जो बोलतोय, माझा आवाज आहे, this is a आवाज, my sound, sinusoidal wave, analog wave. आता हे analog wave, it varies continuously over the time. बरोबर आहे, it varies continuously over the time. This is a information signal. आता याच्यामध्ये काय बदलतंय, ह्या वेव्हचं काय बदलतंय, ह्या वेव्हचा एम्प्लीट्यूड बदलतोय. करेक्ट है, यहां से यहां तक एम्प्लीट्यूड गोज ऑन चेंज. So this is a amplitude varying wave, analog wave, where the amplitude varies continuously with time. Okay. Then we have a carrier wave. Then we have a carrier wave. When we have a carrier wave, in the carrier wave, we have a high frequency signal. This is a very, आता याची frequency बघितली तर एवढी आहे. याच्यामध्ये किती आहे, the number of cycles in unit time किती आहे, समजा इथं 1 असेल तर याच्यामध्ये किती येत आहेत, 1 2 3 4, म्हणजे more than 10 comes. So we have the things. So we have the thing. This is a wave, sinusoidal wave, information signal, EM. Now the amplitude of the wave changes continuously with time. This is a low frequency signal. And then we have a carrier. This EM is nothing but the amplitude of the modulating signal. Modulating signal, त्यालाच message signal म्हणू शकता तुम्ही, त्यालाच information signal म्हणू शकता, त्यालाच baseband signal म्हणू शकता. So baseband signal, modulating signal, information signal, message signal, all are at the same point. So EM is nothing but the amplitude of the modulating signal. Now this is the low frequency signal, because we have within 1 unit we have only 1 cycle, and here we have a 10 cycles. So the second thing is the carrier signal. EC is the amplitude of the carrier signal. This is a high frequency signal. Ata, this wave is superimposed on this high frequency carrier signal. When the wave is superimposed on the carrier signal and the modulation happens, आता जिथं इथं 0 amplitude आहे तिथं काय फरक पडत नाही, as it is wave आहे बघा. आणि ही वेव्ह ह्या वेव्ह वरती अशी सुपरइम्पोज झाली, मायनस झालं की हा EC मायनस EM झाला. म्हणजे जिथं EC इथं 0 आहे समजा, EM इथं EM 0 आहे समजा, इथं EM 0 आहे तर तुम्हाला as it is इथं EC मिळालं. पण when there is a change in the amplitude of the information signal, there is also change in the amplitude of the modulating signal. इथं मायनस झालंय, निगेटिव्ह आहे, म्हणजे प्लस मायनस becoming minus. So it gets reduced. So this is the information signal. This is the high frequency carrier signal, and when the information signal is superimposed on the high frequency carrier signal, we get an amplitude modulated wave, and the nature of the wave is like this. So the amplitude, आता इथं बघा, इथं amplitude इथं वाढला, इथं जास्त झालाय, परत इथं कमी झालाय, इथं वाढत गेला, इथं maximum झाला, इथं परत कमी झाला. So the amplitude of the carrier signal, high frequency signal, is varied according to the amplitude of the information signal. This process is called as a amplitude modulation, and this amplitude, it is called as a maximum amplitude, and this is called as a minimum amplitude. Minimum का आला, हे निगेटिव्ह आहे आणि हे पॉझिटिव्ह आहे. पॉझिटिव्ह निगेटिव्ह इट्स सबट्रॅक्टिव्ह, EC मायनस EM होतं, हे इथं दाखवलं आपण, हे जे आहे ना मिनिमम, दिस इज EC मायनस, आणि ऍडिशन झाली तर we have a EC plus EM. So we have when the subtraction, that is called as a minimum amplitude, and we have a maximum amplitude, that is called as a addition, EC plus EM. So when we have a EC plus EM, we have an addition of the amplitude, and then we have a EC minus EM, we have a subtraction in the amplitude. So minimum amplitude is there, maximum amplitude is there, and the envelope of the amplitude modulated wave, it has the nature like this. Very simple. So amplitude modulation is the process in which the amplitude of the carrier signal is varied according to the amplitude of the information signal by keeping the phase and frequency of carrier signal constant. That is called as a amplitude modulation process. आता बघा याच्यामध्ये किती वेव होतं समजा इथपर्यंत इथे जेवढ्या वेव होत्या तेवढ्याच इथं आलेले आहेत मीन्स इट्स फ्रिक्वेन्सी इज केप्ट कॉन्स्टंट याचा अँगल इट इज केप्ट कॉन्स्टंट सो फेज इज केप्ट कॉन्स्टंट सो frequency and phase is kept constant in the amplitude modulation process. So amplitude modulation is the process in which the amplitude of the carrier signal is varied according to the amplitude of the information signal or baseband signal, or that is also called as a message signal or modulating signal, by keeping frequency and phase of the carrier signal constant. So today, this one is sufficient. So you should keep in mind the amplitude modulation process.